Good day. In today's day, I'd like to share with you the top 10 reasons for rejection in job interviews, and I'm primarily referring to FANG companies here. The top reason for rejection in these interviews, in my opinion, is due to a lack of communication. What do I mean by this? Well, maybe you prepared some great stories on paper, but what happens is you only deliver them for the first time during a job interview, and that's when you realize it's not at all what you thought they would sound like. Okay, or another very common scenario is people are rambling a lot simply because they lack clarity of thought in communicating the idea they want to transmit. Or another scenario would be when candidates are simply unintelligible. Okay, the way you speak is designed so only you can understand what you say. Okay, so what's the fix here? Well, the most straightforward fix would be to role play these answers, or to role play with someone if you know that communication is not your strength. Okay, the second common reason for rejection is job interviews is candidates get stuck or almost get stuck, and this primarily stems from three scenarios, let's say. Okay, for instance, you fail to prepare the failure stories. Okay, so you fail to prepare some less intuitive types of questions for the job interview, and when you hear them for the first time, maybe you will not completely get stuck, but you will have a hard time speaking about failure unless you prepare for these things in advance. Or the second scenario, which is very common for freshers, is what I call the memorizer, or people tend to memorize answers to commonly asked questions, and in a job interview maybe you'll get asked a question you haven't prepared for, and that's when you get stuck. Okay, or a third scenario could be when you have your interviewer to reframe the question in a counterintuitive fashion, and you will not understand, you will not know how to deal with that question because you cannot read between the lines of the question itself. Such as, for example, what's the biggest misconception your coworkers have about you, and why do they think that? Okay, so if you read a little bit between the lines, you'll notice that maybe you can pitch this with your weakness. Okay, so what's the fix here? Not to get stuck. Well, obviously to prepare the niche scenarios, obviously not to memorize answers, but rather think in stories, and of course, build your listening skills, right? There are tools for this. Roleplay is one of them. Could be also quizzes in my training programs and various other stuff, right? The third common reason for rejection in the job interviews would be candidates prepare the wrong stuff for their upcoming interviews. One very common scenario is when people expect a technical interview when in fact it's going to be fully behavioral. And you'd ask yourself, but why would people estimate so poorly on these things? Could even be, I've seen numerous instances where candidates blindly followed recruiter advice, which the candidate themselves pushed for. Hey, recruiter, what should I prep? What should I prep? What should I prep? And the recruiter, or whomever your point of contact would be, would give you some advice that they think would work, and it's not always that you know what to expect. For instance, recently had someone who interviewed with a VP, and they blindly followed recruiter's advice. It's going to be a super technical interview on some given stuff, and the interview turned out to be fully behavioral. Okay, when in fact, if you read a little bit between the lines of your interviewers, an interview with a VP is very unlikely to be so technical, right? So my recommendation here is to use a bit of critical thinking to set yourself the right type of expectations from that type of interview, and don't push too much people for insight in the interview process, because they don't have much incentive to help you anyway. Okay, so this is business after all. Okay, the fourth scenario I'd like to share with you for which candidates fail job interviews nowadays would be candidates who lie and most often get caught. Okay, so what do I mean by lying in job interviews? Well, there's plenty of ways, even creative ways, candidates try to bias the interviewers towards them. But stuff such as taking ownership for something you didn't own, that's called lying. Okay, there's the backbone test, there's various others challenge questions that might test for this. And in companies such as Amazon, whenever you start an answer with "we did this," the trigger will be always, "Hey, but did you own that? Did you say what? Did you did what you say you did?" And all that of stuff. And the other very common scenario of people lying in job interviews these days is trying to look more senior than they are. Okay, so I'm just giving you what I see. Okay, so the fix here, well, obviously, I do not recommend lying, especially in behavioral interviews, which are designed, to spot human behavior after all, because if you put yourself in my shoes or in your interviewer's shoes for someone who's doing this full time, you'll be surprised how easy it is to spot these behaviors. Okay, the fifth reason for rejection in job interviews nowadays would be people who act unprofessional. Okay, unprofessional, I mean primarily two things. First is people who are unreliable, who are not on time. Okay, it does happen, believe it or not. It does happen quite a lot, unfortunately. And the other scenario of what I also would be inclined to say it's unprofessional is when people don't take interviews seriously. I'm speaking about final interview rounds primarily here. Because what happens is, for a screening round, they don't expect you to prepare too much for that occasion, but for a final interview round, simply because the investment on the employer side is quite significant, they do invest some of their best people's times in the process. Not preparing, not taking it seriously, I found that it's unprofessional, and oftentimes this shows quite early in the process. Right, so whenever the fix here would be to ensure that you convince them that you take their interviews seriously. Okay, maybe read a little bit about the company, do some interview prep, interview training, interview coaching, and stuff like that. Right. Number 6. Another very common reason for candidates to get rejected nowadays in job interviews is they're overqualified. Okay, so what happens is that if you're overqualified, they will be skeptical about your engagement or your genuine interest in the role, and they will be worried that you're going to be very likely to move on from that opportunity as quickly as possible. Okay, so what happens is, what's the fix here if you feel like you might fall into this? One option could be that you should prepare to be upfront about these things and don't let the conversation trend towards that, but rather be upfront and show high levels of engagement. I found that candidates who show, that's the best use case for showing energy and enthusiasm in a job interview, which I found that's the best use case I found that would correlate with some quantifiable outcomes. So when you feel like you're overqualified, if you sell yourself as highly engaged and highly enthusiastic about the opportunity, especially in the "why do you want to work for this company" type of questions, that's when I found some better outcomes. And all in all, what I would also recommend is to sell yourself. Hey, what's in for them? Why would they choose you versus someone else? What's your unique value proposition? Because at the end of the day, they're also a commercial entity, right? So especially for very senior types, for more senior types of roles, convince them what's in for them. Answer this question super well, and also based on who you're interviewing with, ideally, right? Point number 7, bad-mouthing other employees or other people or your previous employers, bad-mouthing, being critical about others, is something that candidates who have this problem, or candidates who have this issue or have had some issues with their previous employers, would know that they should stay away from telling this in a job interview. But the problem here is not that you know you shouldn't say this, but the problem is you would say it anyway. And it's a lot easier to spill the beans than most of you realize. And what can you do about this? Well, obviously you should prepare some conflict stories on how you deliver that in such a way that it doesn't sound as bad-mouthing. But more interestingly, if you have some examples that are truly dangerous, you should maybe skip them, because I've had candidates with 20 years of experience and who are keep focusing on some very dangerous answer which they had to challenge themselves in communicating. So then I would recommend simply picking a better answer, a better story from your experience, and stay away from dangerous ones which might come across as bad-mouthing others. But this type of behavior does still happen in job interviews more often than most of you realize. Okay. Number 8 reason for rejection in these job interviews would be lack of recent experience that's relevant to the role. Okay, so what happens is that some candidates, especially the ones with 15 years of experience, they say that I'm super qualified for the role that I'm applying for, but the most relevant of my experience was, over 7 years ago, was in the first half of my career. So then what can you do about this? The idea that how to sell yourself here is if communication is a strength you have, then you could sell with you should have 2 answers to the question. Hey, you could say, hey, interviewer, yes, I have this great, amazing, example of when I exhibited this subject matter expertise or this behavior that you're interested in, which happened early on in my career. And I have, another relevant example, but maybe you are more senior in your most recent role, which I believe also could be interesting for you to know, and you would either present them both, either present as a choice. Okay, because this is, if communication is a strength you have, that's your best bet to bias them towards you in job interviews. Okay. In my experience, it's also that great stories will compensate for this problem, that lack of recent experience. So if you have an amazing story that happened 10 years ago or 12 years ago, in my opinion, that will substitute a more recent experience, which was only last year. But by best story, by amazing story, I do not mean amazing story by the numbers. I also mean the way you communicate that story, even if it was older. So you should focus on communicating that as a story that sounds amazing. Okay, so if you bias them with that, if you can bias them with that older story, then do it, because they're gonna feel if there's value for them. But if you still have this problem, then you could also present them with a choice, as I said previously, with the 2 stories, on the condition that communication would be your strength, right? So if you lack recent experience recent experience, communication would be something that you would want to definitely improve on, because you want to communicate well to improve your chances to bias them a little bit towards you. Okay. Number 9 would be unexplained employment gaps in your CV. Okay, so for example, if you've done nothing for the past 2 years, then you're very unlikely to have them to take a risk with you. Okay, so now what can you do about this? Well, maybe you had a startup in the past 2 years, so it's better than nothing, if that was genuinely the case. If it wasn't, then I believe that you're in a very dangerous situation. You might want to consider an intermediate role before applying into a FANG, because what you should understand is about a risk. Will they take risk with you? In my experience, they are very unlikely to take huge risks unless you are a really exceptional candidate, or maybe you have some amazing recommendations from someone. But huge employment gaps in CV is also something that will seriously damage your chances to pass these interviews. And finally, number 10 would be a negativism or lack of energy or enthusiasm or interest in the role. Okay, so what I found here is some candidates prefer to interview, to even to read the answers they prepared and then to deliver them very scriptically for the purpose of these job interviews. And if your answers sound flat, then chances are they might not be so impressed about your performance, because even though you think your experiences are something amazing, this might not come across the same way to your interviewer, especially if your interviewer is a non-technical person. Or there are some tests in these job interviews when they ask you what's the core value that you like the most about our company. Many companies will, many candidates would get stuck simply because they did not read those things about their employers. So basically what I'm suggesting you here is, research the company that you're applying for, but usually, people would research these things for the most FANGs, but also to focus on maintaining your performance throughout the interview, throughout the 1 hour interview or even 30-minute interview, because what happens is some people start very strong and then they trend towards less energy to end the interview with weak energy, so to speak. Also, the other thing you'd want to pay attention to and maybe check your story bank for is if you have a tendency to end your answers on a negative note. Okay, so you should always, if you have this problem, then maybe a fix would be to add some learnings into your stories, to add something interesting, to sell yourself in some way, so that your answers sound more interesting and engaging in the way you communicate them. And finally, one tip you can do here is to keep a note to smile every now and then, or at least to make eye contact with your interviewers in a bit, to show as more engaged and more interested in the conversation. So there you go. These were my top 10 rejection reasons in job interviews. I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.